Hello everybody. Thanks again for visiting my YouTube channel. We're here discussing the Lord's Recovery Movement, also known as the local church movement of Witness Lee. And in the last episode, I presented an argument that the Lord's Recovery leaders abused the idea of oneness in order to keep members in their movement. And I just thought of some more things to talk about that people might have had questions about, so I wanted to make sure I followed up quickly and covered these ideas. Now, there is the concept in the Lord's Recovery they talk about a lot, thinking the one thing and being like-minded. There's verses in the Bible about that kind of thing. For example, Philippians chapter 2, starting in verse 2, Paul says, "Then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind." So what's Paul talking about here? It's pretty clear that he's talking about having an attitude of general agreement, general getting along with one another. Not the idea, as Lord's Recovery would say, that it's about totally thinking everything exactly alike and never disagreeing. He's not talking about that. He's talking about having a general attitude of cooperation and getting along. It's really a very human concept when you think about it. In any kind of group, you want to have harmony. You want to get along. You want to not have any rancor. At the same time, you know sometimes there's going to be disagreement, and you try to work those things out. But the way Lord's Recovery dealt with it is they felt like any kind of dissent or any kind of disagreement was a bad sign. That's just not what this verse is talking about, because look how he follows it up in verse 3. "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others." So what Paul is talking about is an attitude of caring and loving and not being selfish. Let me give you an example. Suppose the church says, "We're going to have a special event this weekend. We're going to have a barbecue, and we want you to invite your friends and everything. It's just going to be a friendly time where we introduce people to our church and try to show them Jesus' love and try to meet some people in the community and that kind of thing." And right away you go, "I don't think that's a good idea. Who thought of this? This is a dumb idea." And right away you're just being a problem. And you're thinking about your opinion. You're thinking about you don't like the idea and you think your opinion's smarter. And you just kind of have a bad attitude. Well, that's what Paul's talking about. He's not talking about, for example, you hear that the leaders of the church you're in or the leaders of the Christian movement you're in are concealing sexual predators among their leaders and covering them up and deporting the victims and hushing it up. And you go to them and you say, "I've heard this, what's going on?" And they go, "You're being divisive. You're not thinking the one thing. You're being negative." This is what I'm talking about. The Lord's Recovery takes everything to an extreme. They take these extreme interpretations of the Bible and they use them for their selfish benefit. And actually, they're doing exactly what Paul says not to do in verse 3. Paul says, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit." Well, what could be more selfish ambition and vain conceit than concealing sexual predators to protect the image of your group? Again, in 1 Peter 3:8, Peter says, "Now finally all of you should be like-minded and sympathetic, should love believers and be compassionate and humble." What's he talking about? Again, he's talking about love. He's talking about an attitude of getting along with one another. He's talking about not having a cantankerous, confrontational attitude that's based in the flesh. But that doesn't mean that you can't be concerned about genuine issues or even relatively minor issues that are important to you. The idea is, what is your motive? Is your motive to just make trouble and it's all about you and your opinion? Or is your motive actually, hey, things can improve here. We can do some things to make some improvements and I'd like to bring up this idea. Now, at some point you have to figure out, well, maybe they're not going to listen to you. But when it becomes a moral or ethical issue, a serious biblical issue about something that's evil, then of course you've got to speak up. And of course you've got to make a decision about sticking with this group. And what the Lord's Recovery says is, no, we can never be wrong. Or you have to go along with anything that happens here because that's oneness. Let me tell you straight out right now, that is not oneness. That is the abuse of the idea of oneness. To tell somebody that they have to put up with rank evil and crimes and sexual predators and other hanky-panky, blowing up churches, sending moles into churches, lying about people, character assassination, suing other Christians and churches. You do not have to tolerate that stuff in the name of oneness. That is a travesty, and that is outrageous to use the idea of oneness to those ends. That is not oneness. And these guys have perverted the idea of oneness to such an extent that they feel like they can get away with anything, because it all becomes about what the leaders want. And the problem with the Lord's Recovery is they have leveraged Bible verses to benefit themselves. Ideas like oneness. Oneness is something of the Trinity. Oneness is something from the nature of God. It is something that connects all of us in a spiritual way. It doesn't mean that you conform to the orders of some self-appointed leaders. Guys that come along and say, we're the continuation of the ministry of the age, so you have to listen to us. Let me tell you this. Anybody that says that has thereby invalidated themselves. If you start saying you got to follow me because I'm the ministry of the age, you've just said, don't follow me. That's what you should hear. When you hear that stuff, when you hear you got to follow us because we're the Lord's Recovery and we're the ministry of the age, when you hear anybody, any group, anywhere making those kind of claims, what you should hear is, don't follow these guys. There's also the verses in the New Testament about division. That's a subject that the Lord's Recovery harps on. And of course, being divisive in their world is being contrary to them. But Paul says, for example, in 1 Corinthians 1:10, that there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind and the same judgment. What is Paul talking about here with this sentiment? Again, he's talking about, I believe, a kind of general idea of getting along and having an attitude of cooperation and not being antagonistic just for the sake of being antagonistic. In Romans 16:17, and this is a big one that Lord's Recovery is used to attack people that disagree or who seem to be causing dissent, is watch out for those who cause divisions and put obstacles in your way that are contrary to the teaching you have learned. Keep away from them. Well, what's the teaching you have learned he's talking about? Is he talking about when somebody talks about some minor issue? That can't be the case, because Paul has already said earlier that let each be fully persuaded in their own mind about certain things. So there is room for disagreement. So clearly what Paul's talking about is big issues. He's talking about ideas of the faith, because he says that these are things that can put an obstacle in the way of your faith. It's something that can upset your faith. Well, saying I don't believe we should have to read the Holy Word for morning devotion or whatever they call it is not that kind of thing. Something that can upset your faith is starting to say, I'm not sure that Jesus is the only way to God. Or, I think you can be saved by baptism alone. Something that's contrary to the faith again. He's talking about big issues. He's not talking about minor issues. He certainly isn't talking about that you have to be in the Lord's Recovery. As if somebody starts teaching, I don't believe you have to be in the Lord's Recovery to please God. You can't exist in the Lord's Recovery and make that kind of statement. In any mainstream community church in America, you could be talking to some of your Christian friends there and say, I don't believe you need to be in our church to go on with God. And everybody will just kind of nod. No, you don't have to. But in the Lord's Recovery, you can't do that. Do you think that is something Paul was talking about, contrary to the teaching you have learned? So they've basically taken that verse and said, the teaching he's talking about is anything we teach. Okay, that's not what Paul said. He said what Paul taught, what the apostles taught. Well, what did they teach? They taught about Jesus. They taught about the gospel. They taught about the big theme of salvation and redemption and the cross and these things that are necessary to even be a Christian. He didn't talk about whether he was the minister of the age. Do you think one of the things Paul taught was that he expected them to believe and continue to go along with and not have any questions about was whether he was the minister of the age or even whether he was an apostle? Because if that was the case, then when he talked to the Corinthians about how some of them were favoring these other apostles and some of them were questioning Paul, he didn't say, you're contrary to what I've taught. You're quarantined now. No, he pled his case. He said, they might be an apostle, but I'm one too. That's all he said. He didn't say, you're contrary to what you've been taught because you questioned me. Okay, so this is just lame once again. And this is what they do. They take these verses about broad themes of division and being a problem and being cantankerous and upsetting a whole church because you're such a pain in the rear, and making it like if you have a problem with what the Blended Brothers are doing, some of their shenanigans and some of the nonsense they pull, suing people, and you can't talk about that, you can't mention that, or you're some kind of dissenter. That's megalomania is what that is. So I just wanted to follow up on these themes and make this clear. This whole thing of division, the Lord's Recovery has, again, a warped view of division. And again, it's self-serving. They have this continual pattern of interpreting Bible verses to empower them to control people and keep them in their group. And that is not what the Bible is about. Bible is not about leveraging verses to keep people in your group and calling people divisive if they don't agree with everything you say, just because you're a leader. God can flip the tables on anybody. He can make you the leader. He can make you the sent one. He can make you the prophet. Nathan the prophet went to David and rebuked him for what he did with Bathsheba and Uriah. He stole Bathsheba from Uriah, and then he basically had Uriah murdered. And God told Nathan, go rebuke David, and he did. Where's the prophet in the New Testament in the Lord's Recovery's universe? Where's the prophet? God always could raise up a prophet anytime in the Old Testament. Raise up a prophet to rebuke anybody. And he did. And he can raise you up. He can raise you up. So, like I said, God can flip the tables on these guys. They don't have tenure. They don't have some kind of lifelong authority that's assigned to them because they knew Witness Lee. So anyway, be free in Christ. Thanks for listening. Take care.